My name is Waylon Snedker. I'm the developer of Odd Realm. I've been making games as a career since 2011, and I started my own indie company in 2017. My first and current game is Odd Realm. It's a settlement sandbox simulation game. It's set in a fantasy world. I always imagined it as like top-down Minecraft sort of, but instead of controlling the one guy, you're controlling a bunch of them, trying to keep them alive. And there's some different playable races. Because it's a sandbox, there's no real end goal. It's more about being creative, surviving, seeing what you can build, and discovering the lore in the game.
So you've been working on Odd Realm for quite a while. I'm kind of curious, like, where the idea for the game came from in the first place. Like, what was the initial inspiration that made you start working on and developing Odd Realm?
So I'm sure nobody's going to be surprised, but I was playing Dwarf Fortress. It was 2016, right at the end, and I was just about to quit my job. I was prototyping like this, I don't know, sort of Zelda-like RPG game, and realized that it was going to be way too huge in scope artistically for my skills. Anyways, I was playing Dwarf Fortress, and I thought, man, it'd be so fun just to make, just for fun, to challenge myself, my technical skills specifically, if I just made like a DF Lite. Because, I don't know, Dwarf Fortress has been in development for like 15 plus years, 20 years, and so I wasn't trying to make Dwarf Fortress at the time, or I didn't want to. I just wanted to learn how to do procedural generation, you know, try and keep some settlers alive, and maybe be able to write some of my own story and characters. And so, you know, I started prototyping the procedural generation of the terrain, and then that led to me prototyping the little characters moving around. And honestly, it was this chain of events and this chain of dependencies that meant never really stopping. I don't know, maybe Tarn and Zach have the same feeling, but I just, you know, especially when I had a community going, I would introduce a new feature, and then it was like, oh, well, we really need this thing. And, you know, I would tell myself that too. And I just never stopped making this game that turned into Odd Realm. Eventually, when I released it on Steam, like, that's what it was. And I couldn't just make a DF Lite. I have to keep going. And I was having a blast doing it, so why not? I thought I would. To me, there's not a lot of games like Dwarf Fortress. You know, you've got your RimWorlds, Nemoria. But there's not that sort of feeling. I think there's like a handful of games that are really like that. And so I thought it was pretty exciting to get into that subgenre. It must have felt, or it feels kind of like what back in the days when Doom first came out, and it's like there were no first-person shooters. That's how I feel like with these simulation games. Yeah, I was just inspired by Dwarf Fortress and the depth and the technical systems, and I just went from there.
So you mentioned that you were working in games for quite a while before working on Odd Realm. When you quit your job and started working on Odd Realm, was it always the intention to release Odd Realm for sale, or is this just something that you were, as you said, that you were messing with procedural generation and just kind of learning? Was it always the plan for it to be a commercial release, or did it just kind of end up happening that way?
Yeah, I think so. At first, I did think about maybe doing something like Dwarf Fortress did, or it still does, where it really relied on donations to keep going, and maybe I could do it part-time. At that point, you know, I'd spent, I guess, 7 years just saving my money to live off of. And the pressure of, okay, well, I need this to make some money was quite extreme. So that outweighed I don't know, I guess I had a romantic idea of being able to be free of Steam and all this stuff if I just sold it through my own website or had donations. And it wasn't realistic to do that. So I did eventually go on itch, and then I followed on Steam a couple months later.
So you started off with itch initially and then moved on to Steam. Since like you're on both storefronts, I'm just kind of curious, like what is it like operating with those two storefronts? Are they super different from your end? Like, do they kind of have their own communities, or is it just kind of all crossover? And Like, does it all just kind of end up back in the same place? Everybody just kind of playing Odd Realm?
Yeah, everything kind of leads back to the Discord channel. That is the main community, which is fantastic. That's why I love Discord. But those two are hugely different platforms. Steam has just incredible player base, and so you can't, if you do want to make any money off your game and continue making games, you pretty much have to sell it on there. But itch, and they're super generous for doing this. They have that, it's like a variable revenue share. Steam just has your straight up cut, and their cut is quite significant. So if you're starting out, and like I was trying to get a foothold myself, it's a bit more challenging. But it really is like your only choice, so you don't have one. But as far as like pros and cons would go, itch is really lovely for getting up and running. It's incredibly easy to use. The tools they provide are simple and everything makes sense. It's all organized really well. The developers are really nice and responsive. If you ever have a question, they surprisingly let you like have Steam keys. So that means people have the option of going back to Steam if they want. And for me, starting out, when I knew I had like a minimum viable product, itch was kind of appealing because I could release to some players. I knew it wasn't going to be that many, or I thought it wasn't going to be that many, and maybe that could help me keep from, you don't want to release on Steam and then have everybody play a buggy build and then give you a bunch of terrible reviews. So itch was a pathway that I could get lots of feedback and then prepare another build for both Steam and itch when it was a bit more ready. I also ran into a case where I was running out of money, and I was hoping itch would make me a little bit of money, but I didn't want to put out a broken build onto Steam. And unfortunately, I did run out of money, but I got a part-time job to get the game to Steam. Itch really helped me out early just to get that feedback and work on the build to get it ready for Steam and make sure that people were not going to be upset with me. Steam, on the other hand, they have so many tools, I think, that itch does not. I could be wrong now, but last I checked, itch doesn't have like cloud saves, for example. And so there's just, it's such an old platform. It's got all these really groovy little tools. I would say the community tools are very similar. Steam's forum is quite heavily populated, so you do get a lot more people communicating to you there. But at the end of the day, everybody just goes to the Discord, I would say.
There's quite a few games, like you kind of mentioned this earlier, there's quite a few games now that are kind of trying to be like Dwarf Fortress, and there's a garbage truck outside. I wonder if that's picking up on my microphone. That are trying to be like Dwarf Fortress, and taking bits and pieces of that market share. And I'm kind of curious, like out of that group of games, you're no longer in development, no Moria, even games like Oxygen not included, but as far in the other direction as like a RimWorld, now even Dwarf Fortress, which is coming to Steam. What makes Odd Realm stand out in your mind?
First and foremost, and this is what people would just see at a glance, it's just the style and I think the charm of the game. I think it does have its own unique look. And gosh, I could be wrong, but I never felt those other, like these other games that I have to compete with, they have a very specific storytelling where most of it's generated, and so I really appreciate that type of gameplay. At the time, I was looking for something where the story was a bit more authored because I'm a huge fan of Tolkien and Terry Pratchett, and I've always wanted to create a world that had lots of history that players could discover and put the puzzle pieces together and see this bigger picture. And maybe you would find a coin and it would say some person's name and this date, and superficially that means nothing to you, but if you keep playing the game, then you find out it's like, oh, this was actually this really important figure that did this and this and this. And the players sort of Sherlock Holmesing the lore together is really engaging, and that's something that I appreciate. And you usually only get this out of reading fantasy books. And so I wanted to try and take a stab at world building that has lots and lots of history behind it and characters. And selfishly, that was to develop my own writing skills and to have fun making the world, but also because I've just never, I haven't experienced too many colony sim games. And I think there's there's something appealing there that hasn't been done.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that it's kind of what I would describe as a wanting genre right now, where when a game pops up, everybody just kind of piles onto it. I think specifically in the more specifically in the RimWorld style of things, like Going Medieval, I think is a recent release that I think a lot of people have been jumping onto, going, "Oh, this is going to be really cool." Mechanically, the game is very, very shallow right now, but like it has the potential to be something really cool in maybe a year or two, right? And I feel like that's kind of the case with every single one of these games. You know, Space Haven came out like a little while ago now, and Space Haven is a lot closer to something like The Sims, where it's a much smaller number of people and you're surviving in a little spaceship, but you're building bigger spaceships as you go from place to place. And I do really feel like it's kind of a wanting genre where there's a lot of people that want to play these types of games. They just don't necessarily know how to find them, or a lot of them don't stand out. And I guess that kind of comes up to the next topic here that I have, which is the visual style of the game. Like you mentioned yourself that it makes the game stand out. And I've seen a lot of people comparing it to, Zelda, also because of the coloration, like a little bit of Minecraft. I've seen people comparing the visuals to like any like SNES RPGs. Like where did the design for the visuals come from?
It is totally a product of many, many tweaks. There was I can't say that there was a specific inspiration. I'm sure subconsciously, yeah, having played all these pixel art games in the past, that those definitely inspired me. But at the time when I was starting the game, I knew I had to have a really bare bones visual look, but it had to be just above Dwarf Fortress. Like I couldn't just do the text ASCII thing. So it had to be a step up, but also I didn't want to spend all my time doing these high resolution renders for things. And so I kind of said this earlier, but I was really lucky that the minimal style ended up being a bit cutesy and charming. That wasn't necessarily my goal, but as I added on to like the shader, it just sort of got this more polished look than like one of the biggest challenges with the Dwarf Fortress top-down style is it's really hard to understand the depth, and so I would look at it and be like, okay, well, what could I do? Let's add maybe a depth fog or something, or let's make it so that the blocks apply a ambient shadow to their neighbors if they're like below them, and so there's like 100 of these little really subtle tweaks that I was lucky enough over time they just together worked really well. The initial goal, or sorry, the initial look came from just me mocking up something in Sprite, and it was like it's actually the one thing that hasn't changed is the 8x8 characters you play with. They're exactly the same from day one, and so they've just been like, I guess, the pillar for the artistic vision. Even though I was trying to make an art style that wouldn't take a lot from my time, I don't want to like downplay pixel art at all. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do, but I just found it was much quicker for me to be like, oh, I'll make an animation for this 8x8 guy is going to be several hours quicker than a let's say 512 by 512 character.
And you're never going to run into the like problems that they ran into with like any polygonal, or they'd run into with a polygonal game where you're like actually animating stuff.
Yeah, no, true. I mean, one thing that kind of sucks with having such a low res game is the legibility is very difficult to get right. The the icons you'll see in the HUD and in like text, like in the middle of text, those are only 5 pixels by 5 pixels. And let me tell you, I have 1,000 icons in my sprite atlas right now. It is so hard to come up with new and interesting icons in that size. It's getting slower and slower as I go.
Oh man, I didn't even think about that. Like, I do have some questions coming up about like UI and design of the UI, but let's talk about the world for a second here. So like, you were mentioning earlier that you really like the storytelling aspect and like funny characters showing up and running into weird things down in the deep. But like, what were kind of your main inspirations when designing the world? Like, what did you pull from the most? Like, where did the ideas for the races come from and the different characters that you run into?
Yeah, as I was saying before, like huge fan of Lord of the Rings, Discworld, that sort of thing. I wanted to make something that had a really rich lore, but was also a bit lighthearted and could make fun of itself and be goofy. And so one thing I knew I didn't want to do is, I think other games do this so well already. I don't think it's necessary for me to do it too. I didn't want to add those Norse races, your elves, dwarves, goblins, those sort of guys. If I'm lazy, sure, I do add things like cows and chickens, and it's just like I just need to get more critters in the game. When I am sitting down seriously and I want to think about, let's say, a new playable race, that's when I get into the, okay, well, what is the design intention for this race going to be? And I always start with a silly name, or at least silly at the time. A lot of them have become more serious. And I try and imagine that from the name. And then I think about, okay, well, what's the design intention if they're going to be playable? If they're playable, it has to be a completely new gameplay style. So if you look at the ancients, they don't need food, but they're super powerful. They don't ever grow old, but the caveat is you have to actually find more of them out in the world, and they're really rare. And then the three other races, they're also individually completely different. And once I have that design intention for each one, then I can start to place the details for their culture and what is their story? Why would they live forever? And who were they before they were skeletons? Stuff like that, which is really compelling to me as a player slash reader of these hardcore fantasy books, like Lord of the Rings. And so, yeah, 100% from those two authors. I can't help but be inspired by like little everyday things as I'm playing. The ancients are definitely inspired by like the Protoss and StarCraft. Protoss and StarCraft are like super powerful, but it's hard to build them. Very similar as the ancients. I don't know if you've ever watched Stargate Atlantis. So in that game, or sorry, not in that game, that show, there's a race that can like siphon other races, and then it like keeps them alive. So I have a race called the Arden, sort of similar sort of thing. And so it's hard not to like, I don't think it is possible to come up with a 100% unique idea, but definitely worth drawing inspiration from them. And then like, you want to add some of your own style to it. So the ancients generally I like to have them be kind of silly. Yeah, I think that answered that in a rambling way.
Kind of curious question here. Why did you, because currently the playable races are the humans and the ancients. Why did you decide to pick the humans and the ancients specifically as the starting playable races?
I had a roadmap list, and I just, that's how they were. Like I knew the humans had to be the first one because they would flesh out the different mechanics a lot. And so it just made sense to go with them first. And then the ancients were, I honestly think, and this isn't super interesting, I think they were just like second on the list. But then the following ones, the order that I'm doing them actually make a lot more sense because the Arden are next up after the ancients, and the Arden require the most complicated systems. So I thought to myself, all right, if they're going to need, they need special capturing mechanics, and they have to be able to incorporate other races into their society so that they can like siphon off them as like cattle. Those are really complicated systems that I got to make, so that's why I wanted to do them third and then get all that stuff out of the way.
We talked earlier a little bit about how small and how many sprites you have. When designing the UI for Oddrealm, how did you like tackle that challenge? Because there is so many submenus within submenus, and UI for complicated games can get quite convoluted and massive. So how did you try to organize your UI and keep it understandable for a normal person?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I was lucky to have some experience programming UI in previous jobs. I started out as like a UI programmer, so technically the technical side of it wasn't so bad. It was just I don't think UI artists and UX designers get enough credit in games because it's such a difficult thing to do. The biggest challenge with Odd Realm, it started out as like, oh, I only need like 1, 2 screens, like it's not so bad. But every system I added needed this bespoke screen. It was very difficult to reuse. A good example with the next update I'm releasing is the diet system. I have to display a unique diet for every race, and that has to have like a really clean way to toggle these and prioritize them. And so you can imagine how this gets quickly very complicated. As that was happening, I would learn little tricks, or mostly people would just give me really great feedback, such as the contrast isn't good enough in the game. Like I can't read this, or what is this icon? And that meant, okay, well now I got to actually go back through all of the other screens, and just maintaining the same style throughout all these windows is like such a humongous task. Not even on top of what is the design of the screen? Like, what's the flow? Do I need to show this button? Is this button in the right spot? And what's the language I want to use here that conveys everything? How does a tutorial light up a panel? Like, a lot of this stuff you don't even really think about when you start development, but it just quickly becomes quite daunting, and it certainly is the reason why I take so long, especially with this last update, to put it out. There are some things which in order to mitigate the amount of work I've had to post 1.0. The main one is localization into different languages. You can imagine, if you added Russian to the game, you need all these characters supported by your font, and I'm no font artist. I tried to make the font in the first couple iterations of the game, and everybody was like, I can't read this. So I ended up using Chevy Ray's, one of his fonts, and he's an amazing artist. So that worked out really well for me, but it meant that there's no support for these other languages. And it's like, okay, well, does that mean I have to use Arial and like totally have a normal text look in a pixel art game? Like, I don't want to do that. So I've had to put that for post 1.0. You can imagine the layout nightmare it'll introduce when some German words are just massive because they just like combine things, and some languages they do right to left instead of left to right. And yeah, there's a lot of really unique challenges that are fun to solve, but they take up so much time. Yeah, I kind of lost my thread, but yes, UI is an absolute nightmare. I love working on it. I think it's really easy to iterate, but the process is so slow.
Something that I'd like to ask about, like the maps themselves. Back at the beginning, you mentioned that you thought that you looked into making a game that was like a DF light type thing. With Dwarf Fortress, you have varying numbers of Z levels based on terrain depth. In Odd Realm, you have 64 Z levels total. Now, was that a decision, like a design decision, to be able to point the players in a specific direction easier, or was that a limitation? Why the 64 number specifically?
Okay, the reason why I do the 30, 16, 32, 64 is because it's it's a lot faster to do the math for the maps in the game. I won't get into too much detail there, as opposed to a map that's 12 by 17. And so 64 was a good way to add more world, but it wasn't gonna be too expensive for the player's CPU. So back then, I wasn't terribly great at writing big systems that generate worlds, and they would be really slow. That's why this last update has taken so long, because I've actually rewritten a lot of that stuff. So in the next update, you can actually choose variable map sizes. You can do as low as 16 by 16 by 16 if you want, or you can go up to 256 by 256 by 64. The reason I capped out at 64 is the size of the maps was just huge, and I just couldn't get it to be really fast. But in the early days, 64 was just a nice, well-rounded number where I could generate terrain that looked great. So I use what's called Perlin noise to do all the terrain generation. And when you have more depth to work out, you kind of have a little bit more fidelity. So you can have really deep ocean trenches and high mountain peaks. But if a player picks the 16 block depth, their maps are going to be really more like plains and like small ponds. You know what I mean?
When in one of the just kind of talking about like just game limitations and design right now, another thing that kind of popped into my head when I was playing recently was you've added migrating, so you can go from one place and pack everything up and move somewhere else. Is there a reason why we can't go back?
The me adding migration to the game should be studied by other developers because I remember people were requesting like, oh, I really want to leave my tile, and at the time I was working on a lot of things, and I have the tendency, good or bad, I just do this thing where it's like it's a Saturday, and I'm just gonna add something kind of fun to the game, something that won't be too bad. And one Saturday I was like, well, why don't I add it so that, or I make it so players can go to a different tile and just leave the other one. And the reason I didn't make it so they could go back is I didn't have the correct code framework to save out all these tiles. This is something I actually wrote in the last year for this next update, where every tile gets saved out individually, and you can now go back. And yeah, it just so happened that at the time I was kind of making a little, way for players to leave. Like, if they destroyed their whole tile, like I don't want to lose my settlement and start fresh, so I can go to the next one. And I wasn't able to save the old one.
So kind of the next question I have lined up here is related to seasons, and a recent game that I played, Songs of Six, like seasons move by like every time you snap your fingers. It's like every like couple minutes a year goes by. RimWorld, a year is maybe an hour and a half. Same with Dwarf Fortress. A year is maybe like an hour and 40 minutes tops if your game's running kind of slow. In Odd Realm, I found that even on pretty high speeds, a year is like 4, 5, 6 hours. Like they kind of take a while. How did you decide, or why? Is there a particular reason why you decided to go with this route of the very slow time pacing, and how did you balance that?
So I will say that the balance in the game is not great. The style of development that I have for the early access this is probably not the great way to do it, but I focus on the breadth of the game rather than the depth right away, and that means that things like content and balancing are kind of a backseat at the moment as I get the systems ready. And the reason I do that is because whenever I write these ubiquitous systems that affect so many things, it really easily unbalances or breaks content, or it just affects it in a negative way that costs me a lot of time. And so one of the biggest points of contention is like, oh, Odd Realm's cool, but it doesn't really have a late game, or the difficulty it'll spike, it'll drop, and like that's totally valid and it's true. It's only because I haven't spent too much time playing. Like, balancing is a very, very slow process, and I just haven't been able to spend time doing it. And then with the current season length, the intention there is that I wanted players to have enough time to establish a settlement, which is definitely too much time, but then the season would change about when they were getting sick of it. So, like, as you're saying, it's 4 or 5 hours. Like, I think that's too long, and that'll definitely change in the future. But the other thing that's kind of hard to balance around is the time for the minute is 1 second. So each minute is a second, and that each day I've gotten to like what I think is a really good feel. It goes into night, like at that perfect moment. And so I still wanted the seasons to have quite a few days, and it just naturally ended up that those all added to being quite long. So I think I'll just have to reduce the amount of days per season.
I also just wanted to say that I really like the way the seasons work in the game. I think that the difference in like the environment visuals and the way the fact that the leaves change color and the grass changes color, and then the snow piles up and buries my walls, and then the baddies run over them and stab my people to death. It's all really quite neat the way it works. And I've seen a lot of people like saying really nice things about the actual kind of just visual design of the different seasons, because they do actually change the atmosphere of the game in pretty dramatic ways. Although I think because you did mention that balancing takes a backseat currently, which I think is actually kind of a positive. Like the game does have points where it's like, oh, there's a difficulty spike, or oh, here's a thing that just kind of happened that I didn't really have any control over, and now I'm dead, or like that does happen. But at the same time, because the game doesn't have much of a late game, at least I don't think currently, I think it's kind of okay, because it's more about just starting over and building another cool town.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people play the game and they see it and they're like, oh, okay, well, this is unfinished or whatever, and it's easy to see it as if I'm done, but, and I know that this is probably going to lead into a later question, but like, this is going to be a long project for me. So for me, I can see the benefit of doing it this way, because I know I'm going to get there no matter what. But for players that are just jumping in, they're like, oh yeah, it's kind of unbalanced, like that sucks now. But later down the road, it just means that I'll be able to actually balance rather than get overwhelmed by, trying to balance a game that has no systems or features.
When working on your roadmap and developing the game, how do you prioritize your work? How do you know what to work on next?
I think I'm going to have so many people disagree with this, but this has worked very well for me. But I know some people just don't have like the same workflow that I do. But I'm very much the type of person, I just work on what makes me happy. And I think that is hugely important for continuing to work on a project. So I never abandon things. I always make sure they're finished. But, if I finish something and I look at my list, then generally speaking, I kind of cross-reference where it's like, okay, I always try and do the really complicated stuff first. The first thing that anybody should put into their game is like a save system, because it's really integral, but it's also quite complicated. So I'll work on something like that, and then I cross that with, oh, well, how fun is this to work on right now? Do I really want to write a file lookup directory thing and like save out whatever? Maybe not. And so I think that is hugely important for keeping up your morale. And, when you're working alone, that is like constantly a battle. And I also really respect the community's feedback. So the community is so important to me, and their opinion is very important, and I think it's invaluable. And a lot of people kind of scoff at what people say, and they oftentimes they know the game better than you. So whenever I have 5 people that in the community and I know that they know what they're talking about, they all say the same thing. They're like, okay, well, the game really needs this. Then I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to focus on that right now. And so it is pretty easy for me to prioritize things using those 3 metrics. I have a giant list. There's also like a Trello, which is like a public-facing list of tasks. And using those different things, I can pretty easily jump onto one thing or the next. And like I was saying earlier, every once in a while I kind of have, it's like a cheat day. So I'll take a Saturday morning and I'll just make something fun. Like I thought it would be fun to add the cloud shadow to the terrain. I thought it might add some like subtle realism to the world. And that only took me like an hour, and it was great. So, you gotta. I think it's really good to inject those things that kind of are easy wins to have a smooth flowing development.
I just want to inject that one of my favorite things about the game is just placing down torches and watching the lantern just fill up.
Oh, you're gonna really like the next update because I've had it so the light actually persists down. Like a lot of the feedback I get is that the underground area is so dark, and the only reason I did it that way is because it was realistic to the real world. Like, yeah, light's not gonna permeate through the dirt. But then I was looking at games like Terraria. I'm like, oh, of course it makes sense in a game that you would have light go through and show you cool dungeons and things like that. So I think you in particular are going to really like that.
I mean, just like digging down a really big ladder mine shaft and then putting lights on either side. And I mean, it kind of shines through the dirt a little bit right now, but not a lot. Actually found kind of a funny, I don't know if I'd even call this a bug because it's kind of unfair to call it a bug, but I found a funny issue where it's like, if you go underground and you take ladders and you just mass drag ladders underground, you can actually like see where dungeons are.
Oh, clever. Yeah, there's so many of those.
Kind of like a dwarven sonar situation.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
When you're putting together a patch for the game, because I know that you've been working on the current patch for quite a while now, how do you know when it's finished? How do you know when to press the go button and send it out to people?
Well, one thing I didn't mention about Steam or itch is it's very easy to have your own like beta branch. And so for every update, I have a list of things that I want to accomplish. And it usually revolves around a big feature or like a playable race. And so this update actually started out as me implementing the Arden race and quickly evolved into more of a focus on getting all the like performance issues out of the way, all the systems issues, all the some of the like quality of life things I wanted. This is gonna be like my huge quality of life performance update. And so I have that as my like lighthouse almost, and that will determine a really finite list of things I want to do. And then once I am confident that that list is complete, I will upload it to, I'll do my own internal playtesting, try and find as many like egregious bugs as I can. I'll fix those up, and then I put it into the beta, and I let it soak in the beta for like 2 weeks. And again, the community is invaluable for this. They'll just tell you right away. It's amazing how quickly they will find things that you've spent 8 hours trying to find everything, and like within 20 minutes they find it, just because it's because of, I don't know, chaos and like the different people doing different things. But they help me find all the really severe bugs, and I try not to ever put the game into production if there's anything more severe than like, there are certain superficial bugs that are okay. It's like, oh, this name might have been cut off. That's okay. But if it's like, oh, I hit this button and nothing happens, then I won't. I never put the game into production that way. And as soon as I'm comfortable I'm confident that those things are done, then I'll. It's like the flip of a switch. It's pretty easy on Steam and itch.io that you just like, okay, that's in production now.
So now's kind of the fun question, which is, will Odd Realm be complete?
I would say no, but not that like I'm not going to get 1.0. I will do a 1.0, but I just want to continue working on the game and the universe for as long as I can. I'm incredibly fortunate that the game makes any money, and I can just live comfortably off that and continue to work on it. And for me, it is something that makes me happy every day. I love all the people I get to meet. I'm so honored that people like yourself actually play the game and stream it. And so why would I not continue working on it? The only time that I think I would have to stop is if it started to make no money and I was like, I had no savings or anything like that. Then what I would do is make probably like a higher resolution version of the game, or maybe a 3D version of it. Something that is still Odd Realm, but it just improves on a grander scale. So yeah, I don't see myself stopping anytime soon.
And so now I'm more or less out of questions. Well, first off, I guess I should say that everybody watching this should go check out Odd Realm on itch.io and Steam if you haven't. Go pick the game up on both platforms and play a lot of it. And is there anything specific you'd like to shout out or say on the way out?
No, I just want to say thanks for even, contacting me and wanting to interview me. It's quite humbling. And I know you have actually supported the game for a long time, so I just want to say thanks for doing that. And I hope some people can play it and have a good time.
I just think that I wish that there was more people doing this kind of thing. I think that there's a lot of... I think that the games industry would be in a much better place if more developers had a voice publicly instead of just lunatics like myself making YouTube videos. But, here we are.
I'm actually surprised how few developers want to engage with communities. It seems like I get so many people that are surprised when I talk back. They're like, what? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just like you. I'm a gamer. Let's hang out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But seriously, thank you very much for taking an hour or so, 45 minutes out of your day to hang out and chat with me and talk about your game.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And to anybody out there watching or listening to this video, thank you very much for taking the time to watch it. And please check out the game. And all the links are available in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.